For 600 years, doctors wrote the same word into a woman's chart before they wrote anything else. Not a diagnosis, not a cause, just a suspicion. And for most of that time, the only thing that ever seemed to change a doctor's mind was a man arriving in the waiting room with the exact same symptoms. This is the story of an illness that moved through the body of a 14-year-old girl on a frozen canal in Holland and did not get a real name, a real cause, or a real cure for the next 500 years. It is the story of a hospital in Paris that once held 8,000 women behind its walls, and of the strange, uncomfortable truth that modern neurology was built, quite literally, on their bodies. And it is the story of what happens to a body when the people responsible for understanding it simply decide, for centuries at a time, not to. It reaches, before the night is through, all the way into the present, into ordinary emergency rooms and ordinary waiting rooms where a version of this same old story is quietly still being written, one appointment at a time. But it begins, as these things so often do, somewhere small and cold and completely unremarkable. A frozen canal, a girl who loved to skate, a single, ordinary winter morning that was never supposed to become anything more than that. Before we go there, a small and sincere thank you. If stories like this one help you drift off at night, staying subscribed means the next one will already be waiting for you when you need it. There is no urgency in that, just an open door. You are standing on the edge of a frozen canal in the town of Schiedam in the county of Holland, in the winter of the year 1396. The air smells of wood smoke and wet wool and the faint mineral tang that rises off ice when the sun first touches it. Somewhere behind you, a church bell marks an hour that no one is in a hurry to obey. The town itself is small and close-built, timber houses leaning toward each other over narrow streets, thatched roofs furred with frost, and beyond the last rooftops, the flat grey country of the Low Countries stretching out toward a sea that never quite stays where it is put. The canal has frozen hard enough to bear weight, and the young people of the town have taken to it the way young people take to anything forbidden by exhaustion and permitted by boredom. There is a particular sound that ice makes under a good blade, a long, clean hiss, and this morning that sound belongs mostly to a 14-year-old girl named Lidwina, the daughter of a labourer, the 9th child in a crowded household, and by every account that survives her, the finest skater on the ice that day. She is quick. She is a little vain about it, in the harmless way of someone who has found the one thing she is genuinely good at. Her friends call her name across the ice, and she turns to answer them, and for a moment everything about her life is exactly as small and as complete as a winter morning in a small Dutch town is supposed to be. Before we go further into what happens next, it helps to understand the world this girl is standing inside. Medieval medicine did not lack curiosity. It lacked instruments. There was no way to look inside a living body and see what was actually happening to it, so physicians of this era worked instead with what they could observe, what they had inherited from older texts, and what their culture already believed about the bodies of women in particular. A great deal of that inheritance traced back to a single, very old idea, one that had already been circulating for close to 2,000 years by the time Lidwina was born, and one that would go on to shape the treatment of women's bodies for a great many centuries after her death. We will sit with that idea properly in a little while. For now, it is enough to know that it existed, quietly, underneath everything that follows. If you would rather close your eyes for this one and simply listen, this story and the rest of this library live as a full audiobook over on Spotify as well, and the link for that is sitting in the description and the pinned comment whenever you want it. There is a particular quality to Dutch winter light that is worth sitting inside for a moment before the story moves forward, because it will return again and again as this history unfolds. It is a pale, flattened light, filtered through low cloud that rarely fully clears, the kind of light that makes a frozen canal look less like ice and more like a long strip of hammered pewter laid across the landscape. It is the light Lidwina skated under. It is the light her family walked through, carrying her home. And it is worth remembering, as this story eventually travels forward, centuries later, into gaslit Parisian lecture halls, and later still into the fluorescent glow of a modern emergency room, that every one of these settings, however different their technology, however different their vocabulary, held the same basic human question inside them: what is happening to this body, and who, if anyone, is going to take the time to find out? The ice takes her without warning. One blade catches an edge, or a groove worn by an earlier skater, or nothing at all that anyone can later identify, and Lidwina goes down hard. her right side striking the frozen surface with the particular flat, final sound of a body meeting something that does not give. Her friends skate over. She cannot get up. A rib is broken, that much is obvious immediately, and she is carried home across the ice and through the narrow streets to her father's house, where she is put to bed to heal in the ordinary way that a broken rib heals, with time and rest and the quiet expectation that in a few weeks she will be back on the canal. The house she is carried into is a modest one, timber-framed, low-ceilinged, the kind of house where a single room often served as kitchen, workshop and bedroom all at once, warmed by a hearth that never quite drove the Dutch winter fully out of the corners. Her mother would have laid her down near that hearth, propped on whatever bedding the household had, and settled in for what everyone assumed would be an ordinary few weeks of recovery, the kind every family in Schiedam had seen before: a bruise, a break, a slow mending, and then a return to the rhythm of ordinary life. Nobody in that room that first evening had any reason to imagine they were witnessing the opening scene of an illness that would outlast nearly every one of them. She is not back on the canal in a few weeks. She is not back on the canal ever again. The rib mends. That much the body manages on its own, the way bodies generally do. But something underneath the rib, something the physicians of Schiedam have no word for and no way to see, does not mend along with it. In the weeks that follow, Lidwina develops a headache that will not lift, then a pain in her teeth so violent that she cannot eat, then a weakness that settles into her legs like a fog settling into a valley, arriving so gradually that no single day can be pointed to as the day she stopped being able to walk without help. Her family does what families in Schiedam do when illness will not resolve itself. They send for help. And in the account written down after her death by the priest Johannes Brugman, and later expanded by others who knew her, the physicians who examine her are thorough by the standards of their time. They observe, they question, they apply the treatments available to them, which mostly means rest, prayer, and the kind of herbal preparations that a 14th century household would have kept close at hand. None of it changes anything. The weakness in her legs deepens. Within a few years of the fall, both legs are effectively paralyzed. One of the men consulted is the court physician to Duke Albrecht of Holland, which tells you something about how seriously the family is taking this by now. A local labourer's daughter does not ordinarily merit a visit from a nobleman's own doctor. He examines her carefully, by the standards available to him, and delivers his verdict. There is no cure. And more than that, in his professional judgment, this is not a case for medicine at all. The Lord's hand, he tells the family, had touched this woman. It is worth sitting with that sentence for a moment because it is doing more work than it appears to be doing. It is not simply a doctor admitting the limits of his knowledge, which would be honest and which happens in every era of medicine, including our own. It is a doctor closing a door. Once an illness has been declared the direct touch of God, rather than a disease with a physical cause waiting to be understood, there is no longer any reason to keep looking for one. The mystery has been solved. Not by finding an answer, but by deciding that an answer is not the right kind of thing to look for. This is the first and by no means the last time in this story that a woman's body will be handed a spiritual explanation in place of a physical one, and it will not happen because the men making that decision are cruel or even especially careless. It will happen because the framework available to them genuinely does not include the kind of answer we would now consider correct. There is no concept of the immune system in the Holland of 1400. There is no concept of the central nervous system as a distinct, injurable structure. There is no microscope, and there will not be one for another 200 years. Faced with a body doing something inexplicable and lacking the tools to look inside it, medieval medicine reaches, understandably, for the explanation it does have, and the explanation it has again and again across an enormous range of unexplained female suffering is the divine, the moral, or the mysterious nature of women themselves. For Lidwina, this reframing does not stay a private diagnosis between doctor and family. It grows. As her condition worsens over the following years, spreading into blindness in one eye, into sporadic open wounds that will not heal, into pains that come and go without any pattern anyone can predict. The people around her begin to read her suffering as something other than illness. A local priest suggests to her, gently, that perhaps she has been chosen, not punished, chosen, selected by God to bear suffering on behalf of others, the way certain saints in the stories she has grown up with were chosen. It is, in its own strange way, an act of kindness. It offers her a story in which her pain means something, rather than a story in which it is simply cruel and pointless. Lidwina takes hold of that story with both hands, and who could blame her? She had spent her whole short life before the fall as an ordinary girl with an ordinary gift for skating. Now she is offered something larger. She begins to fast for long stretches. She reports visions. She becomes known, slowly and then widely, not as a sick woman, but as a holy one, a mystic whose suffering has weight and purpose. Pilgrims begin to visit her sickbed. She develops, by the accounts of those who knew her, a genuine gift for comforting others, listening to the troubles of visitors from her bed with a kind of patience that people found remarkable given what she was living through herself. Here is where the story becomes something more than a footnote in medical history, and something closer to a pattern that will repeat itself for the next 6 centuries. Because what has actually happened to Lidwina, described in the plainest possible modern terms, is this. A physically healthy 14-year-old sustains a fall. In the months that follow, she develops a cluster of neurological symptoms: pain, weakness that progresses to paralysis, vision loss, unpredictable flares of new symptoms separated by periods where things seem to stabilize. Read against a modern clinical checklist. Sitting in a modern neurologist's office, that pattern is immediately recognizable. It sounds like multiple sclerosis. It sounds more specifically like a case with the relapsing, unpredictable course that gives the disease its name: sclerosis in multiple places, damage that appears here and then there, in no pattern the 14th century has any way to chart. This is not a diagnosis anyone can make with certainty at this distance. Medical historians who have studied the surviving accounts of Lidwina's illness are careful about that, and we should be careful too. There is no tissue to examine, no scan to run, only the words of biographers writing after her death, filtered through the particular lens of hagiography, the writing of saints' lives, which has its own agenda and its own habit of shaping a life into a familiar spiritual arc. And yet, when those symptoms are laid out in sequence, the fall, the slow paralysis, the vision loss, the years of unpredictable decline stretching out across more than 3 decades, a number of researchers looking at this case in the 20th century arrived independently at the same striking conclusion. If this is not the earliest recorded case of multiple sclerosis in European history, it is very close to it. Sit with the distance in that for a moment. The disease we now call multiple sclerosis would not receive that name or be recognized as a distinct physical, treatable condition for another 470 years. For nearly 5 centuries, the pattern Lidwina lived through would simply have no medical home to belong to. It would be seen, when it was seen at all, through whatever lens a given century found ready to hand. Divine punishment, divine gift, witchcraft in the unluckier tellings, moral weakness, nerves, and later, hysteria, a word we are going to spend a good deal more time with before this story is finished. Lidwina's own decline continued for 38 years past that first fall on the ice. She died in 1433 at the age of 53, having spent nearly 4 decades of her life largely confined to a bed in a body that had stopped answering to her. In the centuries after her death, her grave became a site of pilgrimage. She was canonized in 1890, formally recognized as a saint by the Catholic Church, and remains today the patron saint of ice skaters and, fittingly, of the chronically ill. There is something quietly devastating in that pairing. The two halves of her life, the joyful athletic girl and the woman who spent decades unable to stand, preserved forever in the same title. In 1947, more than 500 years after her death, researchers examined what remained of her skeletal record and found evidence consistent with limited mobility in both legs and her right arm, a small, cold, physical confirmation of a story that had, up to that point, only ever been told in the language of miracles. It is worth pausing, too, on who actually wrote Lidwina's story down, because it shapes everything we think we know about her. Her earliest and most detailed biographer was a priest named Johannes Brugmann, writing decades after her death, drawing on the recollections of people who had known her, and on an even earlier, shorter account compiled closer to the time of her passing. Later, the Augustinian monk and writer Thomas à Kempis, whose own devotional writing would go on to become some of the most widely read religious literature in Europe, produced his own account of her life as well. Every surviving description of Lidwina's illness, in other words, comes to us filtered through the hands of men writing for a specific religious purpose, decades or more after the fact, working within a literary form, the saint's biography, that has its own conventions and its own expectations about how a holy life is supposed to be shaped on the page, We do not have Lidwina's own words about what her body felt like from the inside. We have other people's careful reconstructions of a life already being shaped, even as it was still being lived, into the outline of a saint. That absence matters more than it might first seem. A patient's own description of her symptoms, the specific sensations, the order in which they arrived, the moments that frightened her most, is exactly the kind of raw material a modern physician relies on to build an accurate diagnosis. Lidwina left none of it behind in her own hand. What survives instead is a curated, retrospective, devotional account, shaped by men who had every reason to emphasize the miraculous over the medical, because the miraculous was the entire point of the document they were writing. This is not a flaw unique to Lidwina's case. It is, as we will see again and again across the centuries this story covers, an old and persistent pattern. Women's physical experience throughout an enormous stretch of history survives most often not in their own words, but in someone else's account of it, shaped by someone else's purpose. It is worth imagining, briefly, what Lidwina herself might have said had anyone thought to ask her directly in her own words, and had those words survived. Not the language of miracle or trial, but the plainer, more physical vocabulary a person actually living inside a failing body tends to reach for. The specific quality of a pain that comes and goes without warning. The particular frustration of a limb that will not do what it is told. The strange, disorienting experience of losing part of your vision and not knowing, in that first frightening moment, whether it will ever return. We do not have any of this. What we have instead is the outline other people drew around her, and it is worth remembering every time this story turns to another woman across the coming centuries, that the outline is very often all that survives, while the person standing inside it goes largely unheard. The physical treatments attempted on Lidwina before the priests and the pilgrims arrived are worth naming plainly as well, because they tell you how thoroughly medieval physicians did try, within the limits of their knowledge, to treat her as an ordinary medical case before they gave up and reached for the divine instead. Contemporary accounts describe attempts at bleeding, the deliberate opening of a vein to remove what was believed to be an excess of one of the body's 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, or yellow bile, the dominant medical framework of the entire period. They describe poultices applied to her wounds and dietary adjustments intended to rebalance whatever humoral imbalance was presumed to be causing her decline. None of it helped. And it is precisely because none of it helped, because every tool available to 14th century medicine failed to make the slightest difference, that the explanation shifted, almost inevitably, toward the one register left standing once medicine had exhausted itself. Not because anyone had proven her illness was spiritual in nature, but because nothing else remained to be tried. There is a detail worth adding here, small but telling, about the specific texture of Lidwina's later years, once the framework of sainthood had fully settled over her illness. Visitors who came to sit with her described a woman who, despite decades of physical suffering, remained remarkably attentive to the people around her, remembering names, asking after children and troubles she had heard about weeks earlier, offering counsel with a patience that struck many of them as extraordinary, given what she herself was living through. It would be easy, from a distance of 6 centuries, to read this only as further evidence supporting the narrative her biographers wanted to tell, the suffering saint whose holiness only deepened alongside her pain. But it is worth allowing a simpler, more human reading to sit alongside that one as well. A person confined to a single room for decades, unable to control almost anything about her own body, may well have found genuine purpose and genuine comfort in being useful to others, in the one way still available to her, listening, remembering, offering whatever wisdom 4 decades of hard, unchosen stillness had actually taught her. Holiness and simple human resilience are not always easy to tell apart from the outside, and perhaps they were never meant to be. It is worth naming, finally, what became of the town around her while all of this unfolded. Schiedam itself continued its ordinary medieval life throughout the 4 decades of Lidwina's illness, its markets opening and closing, its ships coming and going along the waterways that gave the town its livelihood, its own small dramas of birth and death and harvest and hardship playing out in every other household up and down her street, largely indifferent to the singular, slow-motion catastrophe unfolding behind one particular set of shutters. This too is worth remembering, not as a criticism of Schiedam's ordinary residents, who could hardly have been expected to organize their entire town around one neighbor's illness, but as a simple, honest reminder of how illness like this actually unfolds in real time. Not as the center of the world, the way a single dramatic biography might later suggest, but as one particular, private catastrophe unfolding quietly at the edge of everyone else's much louder, much busier, ordinary lives. None of this changes the fact that in her own lifetime, and for centuries after it, the actual physical mechanism of Lidwina's suffering went not just unexplained, but essentially unsought. The explanation offered to her and accepted by everyone around her, including, eventually, Lidwina herself, was not a wrong answer arrived at through careless reasoning. It was the only answer the century had room for. And that, more than any single detail of her illness, is the thing worth carrying with you into the rest of this story. Not that medieval doctors failed a teenage girl through malice, but that an entire civilization's medical imagination simply had no shelf on which to place what was actually happening inside her body. And so it built her a different shelf instead, one made of sainthood and suffering and purpose, because that shelf, at least, it already knew how to build. To understand why a shelf like the one built for Lidwina existed at all, it helps to go further back than 1396, past the Middle Ages entirely, to a much older idea that had already been quietly shaping medicine for close to 2,000 years by the time she was born. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. This is not a coincidence of language. It is the whole theory compressed into a single word. Ancient Greek physicians, working without any real understanding of anatomy beyond what could be observed by dissecting animals, developed the idea that the uterus was not fixed in place inside a woman's body the way other organs were. They believed it could become dislodged, restless, dried out through lack of use, and that it would then wander through the body in search of moisture, pressing against other organs as it travelled. A wandering womb pressing against the lungs might cause difficulty breathing. Pressing near the throat, it might cause a choking sensation. Pressing against the head, headaches, fainting, strange moods, even fits. It sounds, from where we are sitting now, almost too strange to have been taken seriously for as long as it was. But the wandering womb theory did not simply come and go with the ancient world. It persisted, in various forms, dressed in various new vocabularies, for close to 2,000 years. Medieval physicians inherited it directly from Greek and Roman medical texts that continued to be copied, translated, and taught throughout the Middle Ages. The details shifted from century to century. Sometimes the womb was understood to move on its own. Sometimes it was understood to release vapors that traveled through the body and disturbed the mind. But the underlying logic held remarkably steady across an enormous span of time. When a woman presented with symptoms a physician could not otherwise explain, the explanation reached for first, again and again, was her reproductive organs. The treatments that followed from this theory tell you almost everything you need to know about how seriously women's actual reported experience was weighed against a pre-existing belief about their bodies. If the womb was thought to have wandered upward, physicians sometimes prescribed foul-smelling substances held near the nose, on the theory that the womb would be repelled and driven back downward. If it was thought to be dried out and restless, the recommended remedy in a great many medieval and early modern texts was simply marriage and the sexual activity and eventual pregnancy that were assumed to follow from it. An unmarried woman's unexplained symptoms were, under this framework, not treated as a medical mystery to be solved through observation. They were treated as a natural consequence of her reproductive organs going unused, correctable by changing her social and marital status rather than by treating her body directly. There is a particularly striking version of this remedy worth naming because it survived, in one form or another, well into the medieval medical tradition. Physicians sometimes recommended pleasant, sweet-smelling substances be applied near a woman's reproductive organs, on the theory that the womb, drawn toward pleasant scents the way an animal might be drawn toward food, could be coaxed back into its proper position. The underlying logic treated the uterus less like an organ and more like a small, semi-independent creature living inside the body, capable of being lured, repelled, starved, or satisfied, depending entirely on what scent or substance a physician chose to apply. It is difficult, from where we now stand, to overstate just how far this particular model of female anatomy sat from anything resembling an accurate understanding of the reproductive system, and yet it persisted, largely unchallenged, for the better part of 2,000 years. The theory itself has a long and surprisingly well-documented pedigree. Its earliest surviving written form appears in Greek medical texts associated with the physician Hippocrates, active around the 5th century before the Common Era, and it was carried forward, elaborated on, and given further philosophical weight by later Greek and Roman writers, including physicians working within the Roman Empire centuries afterward. By the time these ideas reached medieval Europe, they arrived not as a single fixed doctrine, but as a layered inheritance, passed down through translated texts, monastery libraries, and the medical schools that began forming in cities like Salerno and Bologna from around the 11th century onward. Each generation of physicians who copied and taught these older texts added its own commentary, its own local variation, its own new treatments, but the essential architecture beneath all of it held remarkably still. Unexplained symptoms in a woman traced back sooner or later to her reproductive organs. It is worth pausing on how much this framework accomplishes all at once, without ever requiring anyone to look closely at an actual patient. It explains a huge range of otherwise mysterious symptoms with a single tidy cause. It locates that cause specifically and exclusively in female anatomy, which conveniently means the theory never has to be tested against male patients presenting the same complaints, because male patients are, by definition, exempt from it. And it offers a remedy that reinforces rather than questions the existing social order. A woman suffering from unexplained pain, fatigue, weakness, or neurological symptoms is not a medical puzzle. She is a woman who needs a husband or a child or simply more patience with her God-given lot. This is the water Lidwina's world was swimming in, even though her own case took a different turn, towards sainthood rather than a diagnosis of hysteria. The two paths were not as far apart as they might first appear. Both take a woman's inexplicable physical suffering and relocate its meaning away from her body and into some other register entirely, the spiritual in one case, the reproductive in the other, and in both cases the actual physical mechanism causing the pain is left quite literally unexamined. One further detail about this theory deserves a moment of attention because it explains why it proved so difficult to dislodge even once anatomical knowledge began to improve. The wandering womb theory was never merely a piece of bad science waiting to be corrected by better observation. It was, from its very beginning, tangled together with much broader ideas about what women were for, what a properly functioning female body was supposed to be doing at any given stage of life, and what it meant when that body deviated from its expected course through unmarried adulthood, through infertility, through age. A theory like this does not simply describe a medical condition. It quietly encodes an entire social expectation into the language of anatomy so that treating the symptom and correcting the woman's social position become, in the eyes of the physicians applying it, the exact same act. This is part of why the theory could survive so many centuries of otherwise genuine anatomical progress. It was never really resting on anatomy in the first place. It is worth noting, too, that this same framework carried real consequences for how medieval society understood a woman's stage of life more broadly, beyond illness specifically. Girlhood, the years before marriage, was frequently described in medical texts of the period as a time of particular vulnerability to this kind of complaint, the womb not yet settled into its proper function. Widowhood, similarly, was flagged as a dangerous stage. A woman's reproductive organs suddenly deprived of an activity they had grown accustomed to. Pregnancy itself, by contrast, was often described as a period of unusual health and stability precisely because it represented the womb finally doing the one thing this entire framework assumed it existed to do. A woman's entire life under this model could be mapped as a series of more or less dangerous seasons, each one defined not by her own individual health or circumstances, but by her reproductive organs' presumed state of contentment or restlessness at that particular moment. There is a second historical case worth knowing about here, one that predates Lidwina by nearly 2 centuries and comes from an entirely different corner of medieval Europe. Around the year 1200 in Iceland, an account survives of a woman named Halldóra who is described as suddenly losing both her vision and her ability to move. According to the record, she prayed to the saints, and 7 days later, both her sight and her mobility returned. To a modern reader with some knowledge of neurology, that description is striking for a very specific reason. Relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, the most common form of the disease, is defined precisely by this pattern. Episodes of new or worsening symptoms, called relapses, followed by periods of partial or complete recovery, called remissions. A sudden loss of vision and mobility, followed by a full recovery within a matter of days, is close to a textbook description of a single MS relapse. Nobody in 13th century Iceland had any framework for understanding what had happened to Halldóra beyond the miraculous. Her recovery, when it came, was understood as answered prayer, not as the natural remission phase of an underlying disease process working its way through her nervous system on its own timeline, which, again, is not a failure of intelligence or care on the part of the people around her. It is simply what happens when a real physical process unfolds inside a body that the surrounding medicine has no way to see into. The disease does not wait for the framework to catch up. It simply happens, is witnessed, and is explained in whatever terms are available at the time. It is worth spending a little more time with Halldóra's account, brief as it is, because so few records from this period survive at all, let alone records describing a woman's own physical experience in any detail. What we know of her comes from Icelandic saga material, the same rich tradition of storytelling that preserved so much of medieval Icelandic history for later generations, passed down initially through oral retelling before eventually being committed to parchment. The account is spare, as saga accounts of ordinary lives often are, offering none of the sustained narrative detail that Lidwina's later hagiographers would provide. A woman loses her sight and her ability to move. She prays. 7 days pass. She recovers. The saga moves on to other matters, the way medieval records so often do, treating a woman's neurological crisis as a single notable event within a much longer, busier account of a community's life, rather than as a subject worthy of sustained attention in its own right. That brevity is itself worth noticing because it stands in such contrast to the treatment Lidwina would eventually receive. Halldóra's episode, remarkable as it might look to a modern neurologist studying relapsing remitting patterns, never became the foundation of a cult of sainthood, never drew pilgrims, never generated the kind of sustained written attention that would allow later researchers to trace her case in anything like the detail available for Lidwina. Perhaps her recovery was simply too complete, too quick to generate the same lasting religious significance as a lifetime of visible, ongoing suffering. Perhaps the specific religious and cultural context of 13th century Iceland, different in important ways from 14th century Holland, simply had less use for the narrative of a suffering female saint. Whatever the reason, her case survives today as little more than a fragment, a single striking sentence tucked into a much larger saga, waiting for a modern reader with the right medical vocabulary to recognize what it might actually be describing. Taken together, Lidwina and Halldóra offer something rare in the history of medicine. Two separate, geographically distant medieval accounts, written centuries apart, describing symptom patterns that a modern neurologist would recognize almost immediately, each one absorbed instead into the only interpretive systems their respective centuries had on hand. Sainthood in one case, miracle in the other. Both, in their own way, a kind of mercy, offering meaning where medicine could offer none. And both, in their own way, a door quietly closing on the question of what was physically happening inside these women's bodies, a question that would not seriously reopen for another 600 years. There were, in fairness, other threads of medieval medicine that ran a little more gently alongside this one, and they deserve at least a brief mention here. Convent infirmaries, particularly in parts of medieval Germany and the Low Countries, developed their own traditions of herbal treatment for what would have been described as women's complaints, often blending inherited classical theory with generations of practical, hands-on experience treating real patients. The 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen, working in the Rhineland roughly 2 centuries before Lidwina's birth, produced extensive medical writings of her own, describing treatments for a wide range of conditions drawn from careful, sustained observation of the natural world around her monastery. Her work still leaned heavily on the humoral framework of her era, and still in places echoed the older assumptions about female anatomy this chapter has traced, but it also represents something else worth naming, a woman writing directly and authoritatively about medicine in an era when that was itself a genuinely unusual thing for the historical record to preserve. It is tempting hearing all this from the comfort of the present, to feel a certain distance from it, to file it under things people used to believe before they knew better. But the wandering womb theory did not simply vanish once better anatomy arrived. Its underlying logic, the instinct to locate unexplained female suffering somewhere other than in the body's actual physical processes, proved remarkably durable. It would resurface, restated in newer and more scientific-sounding language in the 19th century, in a hospital in Paris, in the work of the very physician who would finally, after 500 years, give Lidwina's condition a proper name. That story is still a few centuries away. Before we get there, it is worth resting for a moment in the long, quiet gap between Lidwina's death and the next real turning point in this history, because that gap is not empty. It is filled with women, across 400 years, living through symptoms medicine had no name for, absorbed one by one into whatever explanation their own century found ready to hand. Picture the gap in simple terms. Lidwina dies in 1433. The disease she almost certainly lived with will not be given a name, a physical cause, or a clinical description until 1868. That is 435 years. For context, that is roughly the same span of time separating us today from the early days of the printing press. An entire history's worth of ordinary human life passes in that gap, and somewhere within it, an unknown but almost certainly substantial number of women lived through the same pattern Lidwina lived through: the falls, the creeping weakness, the vision that came and went, the pain with no visible wound behind it, and had no more access to an explanation than she did. We do not have their names mostly because the record medieval and early modern Europe kept of ordinary women's illnesses was thin to begin with, and thinner still when that illness did not resolve into either death, recovery, or a story dramatic enough to be worth writing down. What we have instead are the categories these women were most likely sorted into by the physicians, priests, and family members trying to make sense of what was happening to them. It is worth naming a few of those categories plainly because they tell you as much about the era as any single case history could. Before naming those categories, it is worth pausing on the sheer ordinariness of the 4 centuries themselves. This was not a static, frozen span of history waiting patiently for anatomy to catch up. It contained the Renaissance, with its explosion of art and learning. It contained the Reformation, which split the religious landscape of Europe in two, and, with it, reshaped which authorities, church or state, held the power to decide what counted as legitimate medical or spiritual explanation in the first place. It contained the founding of the first universities with dedicated medical faculties, the slow professionalization of surgery as distinct from barbering, and the beginnings of hospitals as institutions organized around treatment rather than simply confinement. Enormous change moved through European society during these 400 years. And through all of it, running underneath every other transformation, the basic explanatory framework applied to unexplained female suffering barely shifted at all. There is a fourth thread worth naming too, one that sits somewhere between the witchcraft accusations and the gentler category of melancholy, the accusation of feigning. Across these 4 centuries, a woman whose symptoms did not fit any recognizable pattern, whose paralysis seemed to come and go, whose pain had no visible wound behind it, ran a real risk of simply being disbelieved outright, accused sometimes openly of exaggerating or inventing her condition entirely for sympathy, attention, or to avoid unwanted obligations, whether marriage, labor, or the ordinary demands of running a household. This accusation, too, has survived remarkably intact into the present day, resurfacing whenever a patient with an invisible, fluctuating illness is met with a raised eyebrow rather than a referral. The specific vocabulary changes from century to century. The underlying suspicion that a woman's account of her own suffering cannot quite be trusted at face value proves considerably more durable. It is worth remembering, too, that court records and church records from across this period, though thin, do occasionally preserve a woman's own petition, her own request for aid, help, or simply belief, in language close enough to her own voice to give us a fragment of what these 4 centuries actually sounded like from the inside. A woman petitioning a parish for continued support after her husband's death, describing an illness that left her unable to work, occasionally survives in the historical record specifically because someone needed to weigh her claim to decide whether her described weakness was genuine enough to warrant continued charity. These documents are transactional rather than medical, written to secure resources rather than to describe symptoms for their own sake, and they are rare. But where they survive, They offer something closer to a direct voice than almost anything else this period left behind. A woman describing in her own words precisely the kind of doubt she knew she would have to overcome before anyone would take her condition seriously at all. In the more dangerous corners of this history, unexplained physical symptoms in women, particularly symptoms involving fits, paralysis, or strange sensations, were sometimes read not as illness at all, but as evidence of witchcraft, either as something being done to the woman, or more perilously, as something she herself was suspected of practicing. The witch trials that swept across parts of Europe in the 15th through 17th centuries did not exist in a vacuum separate from medicine. Medical and religious explanation overlapped constantly during this period, and a body behaving in ways physicians could not account for was, in the wrong town, at the wrong moment, a genuinely dangerous thing to have. In gentler but still deeply limiting corners of this history, unexplained symptoms were folded into the broad and flexible category of melancholy, or later, nerves, a catch-all diagnosis that could absorb almost anything a physician did not have a better name for. Melancholy carried the advantage of being less immediately dangerous than a witchcraft accusation, but it came with its own cost. It framed the sufferer's condition as a matter of temperament and constitution rather than physical disease, something to be managed through diet, rest, and moral discipline rather than investigated and treated. There is a third category worth naming as well, quieter than witchcraft and gentler than melancholy, but in some ways the most pervasive of all across these 4 centuries, simple domestic absorption. A woman whose legs weakened gradually, whose vision blurred and blurred again, whose fatigue never seemed to lift no matter how much she rested, might never be formally diagnosed with anything at all. She might simply be understood within her own household as delicate or sickly or unsuited to the harder physical demands of daily life. Her condition managed quietly at home, worked around by family members who adjusted her share of labor without ever seeking outside explanation for why it was needed. For a great many women living through unexplained neurological symptoms across these centuries, there was no dramatic diagnosis at all, favorable or otherwise. There was simply a slow, permanent renegotiation of what she was expected to do, absorbed into the ordinary rhythms of a household without ever becoming a story anyone thought to write down. And running underneath both of these quietly for the entire span of this 400-year gap was the older inheritance we spent the last chapter with. The wandering womb, or its slightly updated descendants, remained available as an explanation any time a woman's symptoms seemed connected, even loosely, to her reproductive life, her age, her marital status, or simply her sex. A woman experiencing unexplained weakness in her 20s might be told her symptoms would resolve once she married. A woman experiencing them after childbirth might be told they were a natural, if regrettable, consequence of her condition. The explanation adjusted itself to fit the moment, but its basic shape held steady across centuries. Something about being a woman was, in itself, sufficient explanation for suffering that did not fit any other known pattern. It is worth naming, too, that not every woman living through these centuries with unexplained neurological symptoms was necessarily poor or powerless or without any resources at all. Some had access to skilled herbalists, to midwives whose practical knowledge of the body often exceeded that of university-trained physicians, to convents that functioned in some parts of Europe as genuine centers of medical care and pharmaceutical knowledge, particularly for women who might otherwise have received little attention from male physicians at all. This part of the story deserves acknowledgement because it complicates any tidy narrative in which women were simply, uniformly, passive recipients of whatever explanation the medical establishment handed them. Many pushed back in the ways available to them, sought second opinions from healers outside the formal university system, or simply relied on the accumulated practical knowledge passed down through generations of women caring for other women, knowledge that often outperformed formal medicine considerably even without the language of anatomy or pathology to explain why it worked. None of this means medicine stood entirely still during these 4 centuries. It did not. Anatomy advanced considerably, particularly from the 16th century onward, as dissection became more widely practiced and more carefully documented. Physicians developed increasingly detailed maps of the body's visible structure, its bones, its muscles, its major organs. But the nervous system in particular remained stubbornly resistant to this kind of mapping for far longer than most other systems of the body. You can hold a heart in your hands during a dissection and understand, roughly, what it does. a patch of scarred tissue scattered through the white matter of a brain and spinal cord. The actual physical signature of the disease we are tracing through this story is invisible to the naked eye entirely. It cannot be seen without a microscope, and the microscope, though invented in a rudimentary form in the late 1500s, would not be refined enough to reveal tissue at this level of detail for another 2.5 centuries. Consider, too, just how much of the body's interior remained completely theoretical throughout this entire span. Physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries could describe the heart's chambers, the pathways of major blood vessels, the layout of muscle and bone, all of it learned through direct dissection and increasingly accurate anatomical illustration. But the nervous system resisted this kind of mapping in a way almost nothing else in the body did. Nerves themselves were visible enough as fine white threads running through the body, but their function, how a signal actually travelled along them, what a nerve was for, mechanically speaking, remained almost entirely mysterious well into the 18th century. The idea that damage to a specific microscopic structure within the brain or spinal cord could produce a specific, predictable pattern of physical symptoms elsewhere in the body was not simply undiscovered. It was, for most of this period, not even a coherent question that medicine yet knew how to ask. This is worth sitting with because it reframes the whole 400-year gap in a slightly different light. It is not simply that earlier centuries lacked curiosity or lacked compassion or were uniquely inclined to dismiss women's suffering out of some special cruelty absent from other eras. It is that the specific physical evidence this particular disease leaves behind was, quite literally, below the resolution limit of the available technology. You cannot diagnose what you cannot see, and for 400 years nobody anywhere in the world could see it. What filled that gap instead, inevitably, was interpretation, story, category, and the categories available for interpreting unexplained suffering in a woman's body were, as we have seen, rarely kind and almost never physical. The turn finally begins, not with a single dramatic breakthrough, but with a technological shift arriving quietly in the early decades of the 19th century. Better microscopes, better preservation techniques for tissue after death, a growing willingness among a small circle of French and British anatomists to examine, slice, and study the brains and spinal cords of patients who had died with unexplained progressive neurological symptoms during their lives, comparing what they found against the detailed case histories those patients had left behind. In the 1830s, working independently and almost simultaneously on opposite sides of the English Channel, a French anatomist named Jean Cruveilhier and a Scottish pathologist named Robert Carswell each began to notice something. In the brains and spinal cords of certain patients who had suffered from progressive weakness, tremor, and paralysis during their lives, both men found the same distinctive pattern of scarring scattered through the nervous tissue, hardened patches where healthy tissue should have been. Neither man had access to the other's work when he made this observation. Neither had a name yet for what he was looking at, but both had, for the first time in the recorded history of medicine, actually seen it. Robert Carswell, working in London and later in Paris, was known specifically for his extraordinary skill as a medical illustrator, and it is largely thanks to that skill that his observations survive in such vivid detail today. He produced careful hand-coloured drawings of the hardened, discoloured patches he found scattered through the spinal cords of certain deceased patients, preserving on paper a level of visual detail that photography of pathological tissue would not be able to match for decades to come. Jean Cruveilhier, working independently in Paris as one of the leading anatomists of his generation, arrived at strikingly similar findings through his own post-mortem examinations, describing the same island-like patches of hardened tissue interrupting otherwise healthy nervous system material. Both men were, in effect, cataloguers rather than theorists. Neither attempted to build a complete clinical picture connecting what they were seeing in dead tissue to the specific symptoms a patient might have reported while still alive. That final, crucial connection, the one that would transform two isolated anatomical curiosities into an actual diagnosable disease, was still 3.5 decades away. It would take another 3.5 decades and one more physician working in one particular hospital in Paris to take that scattered scarring, connect it definitively to the pattern of symptoms it produced in a living patient, and give the whole thing a name. If you are drifting now, that is exactly where you are meant to be. Let yourself go. And if you would rather finish this one lying down with your eyes already closed, remember, this whole library is sitting on Spotify too. Link in the description and the pinned comment whenever you want it. Before we reach that hospital in Paris, there is one more case worth sitting with, because it stands in such deliberate contrast to Lidwina's, and that contrast tells its own quiet story about whose experience medicine was inclined to take seriously, and why. His name was Augustus d'Este, and he was, by birth, extraordinarily well placed. He was the illegitimate grandson of King George III of England, born in 1794 into a family with wealth, education, and access to the very best medical care available anywhere in Europe. In 1822, at the age of 28, he attended the funeral of a close friend in Belgium, and afterward experienced a sudden, temporary loss of vision. It resolved on its own within a few weeks. He thought little more of it at the time, beyond a passing worry, and returned to his ordinary life. It is worth noting exactly how his journal entries from this earliest period read, because the tone matters as much as the medical content. Augustus wrote, in his own hand, with the careful, slightly formal diction of an educated Englishman of his era, describing his vision loss not as an alarming medical event, but as a curious personal inconvenience, something to be noted, monitored, and set aside. There is no sense in these early pages that he suspected he was documenting the beginning of a lifelong illness. He was simply a methodical man, recording a strange thing that had happened to his body, the way he might have recorded an unusual change in the weather, without yet knowing that this particular entry would one day be read by physicians a century and a half later as the opening line of medical history. What makes Augustus d'Este historically significant is not simply that he happened to develop what modern neurologists now recognize, with a high degree of confidence, as multiple sclerosis. It is that he had both the education and the means to do something almost nobody else living with this pattern of symptoms had done before him. He kept a diary, not a casual one, a meticulous, sustained 26-year record of his own body, tracking each new symptom as it appeared. Each period of improvement, each relapse, each treatment attempted, and its effect, or lack of one. It is worth understanding a little more about who Augustus actually was, because his particular position in the world, neither fully inside the royal family nor entirely outside it, shaped both his access to care and his motivation for documenting his own decline so obsessively. He was the son of Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, one of King George III's many sons, but because his parents' marriage was never formally recognised under British law, Augustus himself was excluded from the line of succession and denied the full royal titles his half-siblings might have carried. He occupied, in other words, a strange and specific social position, close enough to the throne to command excellent physicians and easy access to the medical establishment of his day, yet permanently on its edges in terms of formal recognition. Some historians studying his diaries have speculated that this peculiar in-between status, neither fully included nor fully excluded, may have fed his instinct to document his own life so meticulously, to build on paper the kind of thorough, undeniable record that his own birth had been denied. Reading his journals today, medical historians can trace the unmistakable shape of relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis unfolding across nearly 3 decades of a single documented life. The optic neuritis in 1822, years later, weakness beginning in his legs, numbness, eventually urinary difficulties, and problems with balance severe enough that he required assistance to walk. The disease progressed, as it often does, from a relapsing pattern of attack and partial recovery into what is now called secondary progressive disease, a steadier, less reversible decline. By the later years of his life, he had lost the ability to walk unaided entirely. What makes his diaries so valuable to modern researchers is not simply that they exist, but how precisely they track the particular rhythm of the disease. He recorded not just what he felt, but when, noting the specific sequence in which new symptoms appeared, how long each episode lasted, and which activities seemed to worsen or ease his condition. Modern neurologists who have studied his journals in detail have pointed to specific entries describing a worsening of his vision and coordination after a hot bath, and an improvement in cooler conditions, a pattern now well recognized in multiple sclerosis and known today as Uthoff's phenomenon, in which heat temporarily worsens nerve signal conduction in patients with this specific kind of nerve damage. Augustus had no way of knowing the mechanism behind what he was observing. He simply wrote down faithfully, year after year, that warmth made things worse and coolness made things better, a detail that would not be formally explained by medical science until a German ophthalmologist named Wilhelm Uthoff described the same phenomenon more systematically several decades later in the 1890s. The treatments his physicians attempted reflect exactly where medicine stood at the time, still centuries away from any real understanding of the underlying disease process, but no longer reaching for the divine or the reproductive as its first explanation. Augustus was treated with bloodletting, using leeches applied directly to his skin on the theory, inherited from a much older medical tradition, that illness could be drawn out of the body along with blood. He underwent hydrotherapy, prolonged and often extremely cold water treatments believed to stimulate the nervous system. He was placed on various restrictive dietary regimens. None of it slowed the underlying disease, but notice what is different here and what is not. The treatments themselves were still, by modern standards, closer to guesswork than science. What had changed was the frame around them. Nobody suggested to Augustus d'Este that the Lord's hand had touched him and left it there. Nobody suggested marriage as a remedy. His suffering was treated from the very beginning as a medical problem in need of a medical answer, however wrong those particular answers turned out to be. It is worth imagining for a moment what Augustus's daily experience of illness might actually have looked like, sitting alongside the sparse clinical facts his diaries preserve. Picture a well-appointed room in an English country house, heavy curtains drawn against the cold, a fire kept burning through the winter months because his physicians believed warmth aided circulation, though we now know, thanks to his own careful notes, that warmth in fact worsened his specific symptoms rather than easing them. Picture the leeches themselves, kept in glass jars by his bedside, applied directly to his skin. At intervals his physicians judged appropriate, drawing blood in the belief that illness itself could be drawn out along with it. Picture the long, cold immersions of his hydrotherapy treatments, believed at the time to shock the nervous system back toward healthy function. None of it worked, and on some level, if his diary entries are read closely, Augustus himself seems to have suspected as much even while continuing to submit to each new treatment offered to him, less out of confidence in its effectiveness than out of the simple, exhausting persistence of a man determined not to stop looking for an answer. It is difficult to separate that difference in treatment entirely from the difference in who he was. A wealthy, educated, well-connected man, grandson of a king, with the literacy, the leisure time, and the social standing to document his own illness in exhaustive detail and to command the ongoing attention of the best physicians available to him. Compare that to Lidwina, a labourer's daughter in 14th century Holland, whose entire surviving medical record consists of second-hand descriptions filtered through a priest writing her biography decades after her death for the explicit purpose of supporting her case for sainthood. Two people, separated by nearly 400 years, living through what may well have been the same underlying disease, and leaving behind two entirely different kinds of record, shaped as much by their social position as by their symptoms. In his later years, as his mobility declined further, Augustus continued to travel across Europe in search of any treatment that might help, visiting spa towns famous for their mineral waters, consulting physicians in multiple countries, trying an ever-expanding list of remedies with what his diaries suggest was a mixture of genuine hope and weary, practiced skepticism. He married twice during the course of his illness and continued, as much as his body allowed, to participate in the social and political life available to a man of his standing. What comes through most clearly in his surviving papers is not despair, though there is certainly some of that, but a kind of stubborn, methodical determination to understand what was happening to him even without any hope in his own lifetime of ever receiving an actual answer. Augustus d'Este died in 1848, 20 years before the disease that had shaped so much of his adult life would finally receive its name. His diaries survived him, and in the 20th century, long after his death, medical historians rediscovered and studied them closely, and today his case stands as what many consider the first fully documented, medically legible account of multiple sclerosis in the historical record, not because his disease was somehow more real or more severe than Lidwina's, but because his position in the world gave that disease somewhere to be recorded and someone willing to keep recording it. It is also worth naming, plainly, that Augustus d'Este's maleness alone does not fully explain the different treatment his case received. Being male and being royal, or nearly royal, were, in his particular case, deeply intertwined advantages, arriving together and reinforcing one another. A working-class man in the same era, presenting the same symptoms to a village physician rather than to the finest specialists in London and across the continent, would very likely have received a far less thorough, far less patiently documented course of care. whatever his sex. What Augustus's case demonstrates most clearly is not simply that men were universally believed and women universally dismissed across this history, a claim too simple to survive close examination. It demonstrates instead that wealth, education, and social standing brought a kind of medical attention and documentation that poverty, regardless of sex, tended to be denied, and that this advantage compounded, often significantly, when it was combined with being male in a medical culture that was, at the same time, independently more inclined to take male suffering seriously on its own terms. It is worth setting a specific comparison alongside this point, because it sharpens rather than softens the overall argument. Somewhere in England, in roughly the same decades Augustus was filling his journals, an ordinary working woman experiencing the same optic neuritis, the same creeping leg weakness, the same eventual loss of bladder control would have had access to none of what he had. No private physician willing to travel across Europe at her request. No leisure hours in which to sit and write detailed daily entries about her own symptoms. No social standing that made her suffering worth documenting for its own sake rather than simply worth managing quietly, at home, for as long as her family could manage it and no longer. Her case, whatever it actually was, almost certainly went entirely unrecorded, absorbed into exactly the kind of domestic silence this story described in an earlier chapter, one more name history simply never had the chance to learn. There is a pattern quietly forming here, one that this story is going to return to more than once before it is finished. It is not only that medicine took centuries to develop the tools required to see this disease physically, it is that even once those tools began to arrive, whose suffering got documented carefully enough to matter to that emerging science, and whose suffering was absorbed instead into silence, folklore, or a diagnosis that stopped the questioning rather than starting it, depended enormously on factors that had nothing to do with the disease itself. The next turn in this story takes us to Paris, to a single hospital that would, almost by accident, bring these two threads, the documentation of a real physical disease and the dismissal of unexplained female suffering, into the very same building, under the direction of the very same physician, working at the very same time. The Salpêtrière stands on the eastern edge of Paris, a sprawling complex of stone buildings built originally, centuries earlier, as a gunpowder factory, its name preserving that history, saltpeter being one of gunpowder's essential ingredients. By the middle of the 19th century, it had long since become something else entirely, a vast institution for the poor, the elderly, the mentally ill, and, in enormous numbers, women whose families or communities did not know what else to do with them. At its fullest, the Salpêtrière housed somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 women at once, admitted for reasons ranging from genuine psychiatric illness to epilepsy, poverty, old age, or simply a family's decision that a difficult woman was easier to manage behind institutional walls than within their own household. It is difficult, sitting in the present, to fully absorb the scale of that number. 8,000 women, at points confined within a single complex of buildings on the outskirts of one European city. Some genuinely required medical or psychiatric care by any reasonable standard, ancient or modern. Many others, by the account of historians who have studied the Salpêtrière's admission records closely, were confined for reasons that had far more to do with social control than illness. A woman who was difficult or unwanted or simply inconvenient to the men responsible for her could find her way into this building, and once inside it, she became, in a very direct sense, medical material. A population to be observed, catalogued, and studied. To walk through the Salpêtrière in the middle of the 19th century, before Charcot's reforms began to reshape it, was reportedly to walk through something closer to a small, self-contained city than a hospital in any modern sense. It had its own chapel, its own bakery, its own gardens, its own internal hierarchy of wards sorting women by the nature of their supposed affliction, the elderly separated from the epileptic separated from those labelled insane, the insane separated again from those simply considered incurable or difficult. Some women admitted decades earlier had grown old and died within its walls, having entered as young women for reasons that, by the time of their death, no living relative could fully explain or remember. It was, in the words later historians have used to describe it, simultaneously a hospital, an asylum, a poorhouse, and a prison, its exact character shifting depending on which ward and which decade you happen to be standing in. It is worth understanding a little of how a woman actually arrived at the Salpêtrière's gates in the first place, because admission itself tells you a great deal about the institution's true function. Some women were brought by family members who had simply run out of resources, financial or emotional, to continue caring for a relative with a genuine illness at home. Others arrived through police or municipal channels, swept up during periods when city authorities sought to clear the streets of vagrancy, prostitution, or simple public disorder, categories that, in practice, could stretch to include almost any woman without the protection of a respectable family name. Still others were committed by husbands or fathers on the strength of nothing more than their own testimony that a woman was difficult, disobedient, or inconveniently independent-minded. A legal and social arrangement that gave the men in a woman's life an enormous, largely unchecked power over her freedom. In 1862, a physician named Jean-Martin Charcot became resident physician at the Salpêtrière. He would remain associated with the hospital for the rest of his career, eventually becoming its chief physician, and, in time, one of the most influential figures in the entire history of neurology. It is worth being precise about why Charcot, of all the physicians working in Europe at this moment, was the one who finally connected the scattered observations of Cruveilhier and Carswell 3 decades earlier into a complete, defined, clinically described disease. It was not primarily a matter of individual genius, though Charcot was, by every account, an extraordinarily careful and systematic observer. It was a matter of access, specifically access to an enormous population of patients, a disproportionate number of them women, gathered together in one place over one sustained career in numbers no physician working in ordinary private practice could ever hope to see. Multiple sclerosis, as it happens, affects women at a significantly higher rate than men, a pattern medicine still works to fully explain even now, which meant that among the thousands of women passing through the Salpêtrière during Charcot's tenure there, a meaningful number were living with exactly the disease Cruveilhier and Carswell had glimpsed under their microscopes decades earlier. Charcot had, in effect, been handed the single largest concentrated population of MS patients that any physician in history had ever had the opportunity to observe, study, and compare against one another over time, and he had it specifically because so many women had been swept into this one institution for reasons that had, in most cases, nothing whatsoever to do with their neurological health. Charcot's method, once he turned his systematic attention to these patients, was genuinely rigorous by the standards of his era, and it is part of why his conclusions carried such lasting authority. He combined careful, repeated clinical observation of patients while they were alive, tracking the exact progression of their symptoms over months and sometimes years, with detailed post-mortem examination once they died, comparing what he found in their nervous tissue against the specific pattern of symptoms he had documented while they were still living. This approach, known as the anatomo-clinical method, correlating visible pathology after death with observed symptoms during life, was not invented by Charcot, but he applied it with a thoroughness and a scale that few physicians before him had been able to match, precisely because the Salpêtrière gave him access to so many patients over such a long, uninterrupted span of his own career, all housed conveniently within the same walls he worked in every day. It is worth naming exactly how unusual that scale actually was, set against the wider medical world of his time. A physician working in ordinary private practice, even a busy and well-regarded one, might see a handful of patients presenting with any single rare neurological condition across an entire career, nowhere near enough to reliably distinguish one disease's pattern from another's, or to confidently separate a genuine consistent syndrome from simple coincidence. Charcot, working within the walls of an institution housing thousands of women simultaneously, many of them there for years or decades at a stretch, had something closer to a living laboratory, an ongoing, uninterrupted opportunity to watch the same small number of distinct symptom patterns recur again and again across many different bodies, refining his understanding with each new case in a way that would have been simply impossible anywhere else in the medical world of his era. There is an uncomfortable symmetry sitting inside that fact, and this story is not going to pretend it isn't there. The very system that confined thousands of women, many unjustly, within the walls of an institution built largely around controlling and containing them, is the same system that ultimately produced the clinical evidence needed to finally recognize multiple sclerosis as a real, physical, definable disease. Progress and injustice in this particular building were not opposites working against each other. They were, for a period of several decades, running along the exact same corridor. And it is inside that same corridor, at the exact same time, that Charcot began his other, far more famous body of work, the one that would occupy the second half of his career and shape his public reputation for the rest of his life: hysteria. By the 1870s, Charcot had turned a significant portion of his attention toward patients diagnosed with hysteria, a condition still understood in the language of the era as involving fits, paralysis, sensory disturbances, and dramatic physical symptoms occurring without any clear underlying organic cause. Charcot did not invent this diagnosis. It had existed in various forms for the entire span of medical history we have already walked through, all the way back to that ancient Greek theory of the wandering womb. But Charcot gave it a new home, a new stage, quite literally, in the form of public lectures held every Tuesday at the Salpêtrière, in which selected patients, most of them young women, would be presented before an audience of medical students, visiting physicians, journalists, artists, and, increasingly, curious members of the Parisian public, and induced, through hypnosis, to perform their symptoms for observation. These Tuesday lectures became, in time, something close to a fashionable entertainment. Crowds gathered. 3 patients in particular, known in the surviving records as Blanche, Augustine, and Geneviève, became something like medical celebrities, their contorted poses and dramatic seizures photographed extensively and published in illustrated volumes that circulated well beyond the medical profession. During at least one patient's ball held at the hospital, the unexpected sound of a gong was enough to send several of these young women into sudden cataleptic states in front of the assembled crowd, a detail preserved in the historical record that tells you a great deal about just how theatrical this environment had become and how thin the line had grown between clinical observation and public spectacle. It is worth being fair to the historical record here, because the full picture is more complicated than a simple story of exploitation. Charcot genuinely believed, and argued forcefully against the medical consensus of his day, that hysteria had a real neurological basis rather than being, as many of his contemporaries insisted, simply a matter of moral weakness or feminine excitability. In that sense, he was pushing, in his own imperfect way, against the very tradition of dismissal this story has spent so much time in, but later analysis of the Salpêtrière's own records has suggested something else troubling sitting alongside that intention. Researchers examining patient files from this period have estimated that as few as 12% of the women diagnosed with hysteria at the Salpêtrière between 1870 and 1910 actually displayed the specific, consistent symptom pattern Charcot described as characteristic of the condition. The rest showed a much wider and more varied range of presentations, some of which modern neurology would now recognize as entirely different, entirely organic conditions. Among the visitors drawn to those Tuesday demonstrations in the mid-1880s was a young Austrian neurologist named Sigmund Freud, who traveled to Paris specifically to study under Charcot and spent several months observing his work with hysteria patients firsthand. Freud would later credit this period as genuinely formative, and the questions Charcot's hysteria patients raised for him about the relationship between psychological experience and physical symptoms, about symptoms that seemed to have no organic cause but were nonetheless entirely real to the patient experiencing them, would go on to shape the foundations of psychoanalysis, the discipline Freud built over the following decades. It is a strange thing to sit with that some of the 20th century's most influential ideas about the human mind trace their origin back to a specific ward in a specific hospital filled overwhelmingly with women who had, in large numbers, been placed there by other people for reasons that had little to do with their own consent. Which raises a quiet, unresolved question that sits at the very center of this chapter. In a hospital housing thousands of women, a meaningful number of them almost certainly living with genuine, undiagnosed neurological disease, how many of the women paraded through Charcot's Tuesday demonstrations under the label of hysteria were, in fact, living with something closer to what Lidwina and Augustus D'Este had lived with: multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, other organic neurological conditions entirely, simply lacking in that particular decade the specific diagnostic markers Charcot had learned to associate with the disease he was in the process of naming down the hall. Nobody can answer that question with certainty now, more than a century later. But the fact that it can be asked at all seriously by working neurologists studying this period tells you something important about how unstable the line between a recognized disease and a dismissed one could be even inside the same building under the direction of the same physician in the exact same decade. In 1868, in a lecture delivered at the Salpêtrière, Charcot brought together the pathology first glimpsed by Cruveilhier and Carswell in the 1830s with a complete, systematic description of the symptoms it produced in a living patient. He had, by this point, treated a young woman presenting with a distinctive tremor, along with slurred speech and problems with her eye movements. After her death, he examined her brain and spinal cord directly and found the same hardened, scattered patches of scarring the two earlier anatomists had documented decades before in different patients on different sides of the English Channel, without ever knowing the other's work existed. It helps to picture the room this happened in. Charcot's lectures at the Salpêtrière were, by this point in his career, already well-attended affairs, held in a building equipped, unusually for the period, with something close to a small theatre, rows of seating arranged so that visiting physicians and students could observe a patient presented at the front of the room. It was in a setting very much like this one, rather than in a quiet private consultation, that Charcot first laid out in full systematic detail the disease that would come to be called multiple sclerosis. The same institutional stage that had, in other rooms and on other days, hosted the theatrical hysteria demonstrations, here hosted something closer to the birth of a genuinely new medical category. Charcot connected the two halves of the picture that no one before him had connected: the physical scarring seen after death and the specific pattern of symptoms it produced in a living, breathing patient while she was still alive to describe them. He gave the disease a name: sclerose en plaques, sclerosis in patches, which in the English-speaking medical world would eventually settle into the term still used today, multiple sclerosis. He identified what became known as the Charcot triad, three of the most reliable indicators of the disease: intention tremor, a shaking that appears specifically during purposeful movement; nystagmus, an involuntary flickering movement of the eyes; and scanning speech, a slow, deliberate, oddly separated way of pronouncing syllables. For the first time in the entire recorded history of medicine, going all the way back to a 14-year-old girl on a frozen canal in 1396, this disease had a name, a describable cause, and a defined clinical picture that other physicians anywhere in the world could learn to recognize in their own patients. It is worth naming, too, exactly what Charcot found when he finally examined that young patient's brain and spinal cord after her death, because the physical description itself carries a certain quiet power, even stripped of its medical vocabulary. Scattered through nervous tissue that should have been uniform, smooth, and healthy throughout, he found hardened, discolored patches, some no larger than a grain of rice, others considerably more extensive, each one marking a place where the protective coating around nerve fibers had been stripped away by the body's own immune response, leaving scar tissue behind in its place. Multiplied across the brain and spinal cord, in no single consistent pattern from one patient to the next, these patches produced the enormous variety of symptoms that had made the disease so difficult for earlier physicians to recognize as a single unified condition at all: a tremor here, a vision problem there, a weakness somewhere else entirely, depending only on which specific nerve pathways happened to run through whichever patches of tissue the disease had chosen to damage. The Charcot triad in particular deserves a slightly closer look because of what it represents methodologically, not just clinically. By isolating three specific, observable, testable signs: tremor during intentional movement, a particular flickering of the eyes, and a specific halting quality to speech, Charcot gave physicians something they had never had before for this disease: a checklist, a way of examining a patient in front of them and asking, systematically, does this body show these three things, rather than relying entirely on a patient's own subjective account of how she felt. This shift from subjective report to observable sign mattered enormously for how seriously the disease would come to be taken across the wider medical profession, precisely because it moved the burden of proof away from the patient's word and onto something a physician could see and verify with his own eyes. It is worth noticing, too, the quiet irony sitting inside that shift. The very feature that finally made this women's predominant disease fully credible to 19th century medicine was the fact that it no longer had to be taken solely on a woman's word. It is worth being genuinely honest about what a moment like this actually accomplishes, because it is not nothing, and this story has spent a long time in the centuries before it, when there was no name at all. A name does several distinct kinds of work, all at once, and all of them matter. It gives physicians a shared, teachable category, meaning a doctor examining a patient in London or Vienna or New York could now recognize the same pattern Charcot had described in Paris, rather than each physician independently reinventing an explanation from scratch, the way centuries of doctors before them had been forced to do. It gives the disease a legitimate place inside medical education, meaning future generations of physicians would be actively trained to look for it, rather than stumbling across it by accident the way Cuvelier and Carswell effectively had. And, perhaps most significantly for the shape of this particular story, it gives patients themselves something they had never had access to before, a word to bring into a doctor's office, something to be told they have rather than something to be told they simply are. There is a particular kind of relief worth imagining here, the specific relief of finally having a word to reach for. Picture a patient somewhere in the 1870s or 1880s, in the years just after Charcot's lecture had begun quietly spreading through medical circles, sitting across from a physician who had actually studied his work, describing symptoms she had perhaps already been living with for years, perhaps already been told more than once, were simply nerves. And picture that physician, for the first time, offering her a different answer entirely. Not a cure, not yet, and not for a very long time still to come, but a name, a real, physical, documented condition with a describable cause and a growing body of medical literature behind it. It is difficult to overstate what that single moment of recognition might have meant to a patient who had spent years being quietly, politely disbelieved. That last distinction matters more than it might first appear. Consider the difference. For a patient living with this disease, between a doctor saying your body is producing a specific physical pattern of nerve damage that we have a name for and are beginning to understand, and a doctor saying, as one had said to Lidwina's family nearly 5 centuries earlier, the Lord's hand has touched this woman. Both are, in their own way, explanations, but only one of them opens a door toward further investigation, treatment, and eventually, centuries later, actual therapies capable of slowing the disease's progression. The other closes the door entirely the moment it is spoken. It is worth noting too how the news of Charcot's 1868 lecture actually travelled, because the pace of that spread tells its own story about how medical knowledge moved through the world at the time. There was no instant global publication, no journal article circulating within days to physicians on other continents. Charcot's findings spread first through his own students and colleagues at the Salpêtrière, then gradually outward through published lecture notes, translated medical texts, and the slow, person-to-person network of European medical education, physicians travelling to study under him directly, then carrying what they had learned back to their own hospitals in Germany, Britain, Italy, and eventually across the Atlantic. It would take years, in some cases decades, for physicians in more remote regions to become reliably familiar with the disease Charcot had described, which meant that even after 1868, a woman presenting with early MS symptoms to a physician who happened not to have encountered Charcot's work directly might still, for some further years yet, receive an older, less accurate explanation for her condition. None of this means 1868 marked some clean, immediate turning point after which women with MS were universally believed and promptly treated. It did not. The road from a named disease to a properly understood, properly treated one would stretch across another full century and more, and we are going to spend the rest of this story walking that much longer, much slower road. Effective disease-modifying treatments for multiple sclerosis would not become available until the 1990s, more than 120 years after Charcot's lecture. Even today, in the 21st century, there is no outright cure, only treatments that can slow the disease's progress and manage its symptoms. The road to those treatments, once it finally began in earnest, is worth tracing briefly because it shows just how much sustained, patient scientific effort separates a named disease from a genuinely manageable one. The 20th century brought a slowly deepening understanding of the immune system's role in attacking the protective coating around nerve fibers, the process now understood to underlie MS. It brought, eventually in the second half of the century, the development of magnetic resonance imaging, which for the first time allowed physicians to see in a living patient the same kind of scattered lesions Cuvier and Carswell had only ever been able to find after death. And it brought, finally, in 1993, the approval of the first disease-modifying therapy specifically designed to reduce the frequency and severity of MS relapses, a full 125 years after Charcot had first stood in front of his students at the Salpêtrière and given the disease its name. A century and a quarter from naming to treating, that gap, long as it is still shorter by a wide margin than the gap this story is about to turn toward next. But something important had shifted permanently in 1868, even if the shift was slower and more partial than it should have been. The disease now had a home inside legitimate medicine. It could no longer be waved away entirely as nerves or melancholy or a wandering womb or a spiritual test. Though, as we are about to see, echoes of all of those older explanations would continue to shadow women reporting these exact symptoms for a very long time to come. What had changed was that, for the first time, there was a competing, physical, evidence-based explanation available to push back against those older stories, if a physician was willing to reach for it. And this is where the story of Charcot becomes genuinely difficult to sum up in a single tidy sentence, because he embodies within one career both halves of everything this story has been circling. He is the physician who finally gave multiple sclerosis a proper physical name, ending, in principle, 500 years of women's identical symptoms being explained away as something other than disease. And in the very same hospital, in the very same decade, working with many of the very same categories of institutionalized women, he is also the physician most responsible for popularizing hysteria as a diagnosis, staging some of its most theatrical and, by later analysis, least reliable demonstrations for a paying, curious public. Progress and dismissal running side by side, down the same corridor, inside the same mind. The word hysteria itself would go on to have a strange and stubborn afterlife, well past Charcot's own death in 1893. It travelled from the Salpêtrière into the wider vocabulary of Western medicine, and from there into ordinary speech, where a version of it survives even now, in the casual accusation that someone, usually a woman, is being hysterical, meaning excessive, meaning emotional beyond what the situation calls for. It would take until 1980, remarkably recently when you set it against the 2,000 years this idea had already been circulating, for hysteria to be formally removed as a diagnostic category from the standard manual used by American psychiatry, replaced by more specific and better defined conditions. 2,000 years is a very long run for a single idea rooted at its origin in the belief that a woman's uterus was capable of wandering through her body, causing mischief. It is worth understanding what actually replaced hysteria in 1980, because the replacement itself tells a quietly encouraging part of this story. The diagnostic category was not simply deleted and left as a gap. It was broken apart into a set of more specific, more carefully defined conditions, somatic symptom disorders and conversion disorders among them, each requiring its own particular pattern of evidence rather than serving as a single catch-all label for any physical symptom a physician could not otherwise explain. That distinction matters enormously in practice. A catch-all label invites a physician to stop looking the moment it is applied. A specific, narrowly defined diagnostic category, by contrast, requires the physician to first rule out the other, more common explanations before reaching for it, which means, at least in principle, that a woman's genuinely undiagnosed organic disease is somewhat less likely to be swallowed whole by a label built to explain everything and nothing at once. It is worth noting, too, that the retirement of the word itself did remarkably little to retire the underlying instinct it had described for 2,000 years. Physicians in the decades following 1980 continued, in large enough numbers to be well documented in later research, to reach for softer, more modern-sounding equivalents whenever a patient's symptoms resisted easy explanation. Stress, anxiety, somatization, a term describing psychological distress expressing itself through physical symptoms, which, applied carelessly rather than carefully, could function in practice as hysteria's direct descendant, wearing a more clinical, more defensible vocabulary, but performing, in the wrong hands, precisely the same function, closing a door on further physical investigation rather than opening one. For multiple sclerosis specifically, the decades following Charcot's 1868 lecture brought slow, incremental progress on the science, but something closer to no progress at all on a much older, quieter problem. A woman presenting with the early, often vague symptoms of MS, fatigue that does not resolve with rest, strange tingling or numbness that comes and goes, blurred or double vision, difficulty with balance, mood changes that seem to arrive without any clear cause, continued for decades after Charcot's death to be met in a great many doctors' offices across Europe and North America with a familiar set of assumptions. That she was anxious, that she was under stress, that her symptoms were, in the vocabulary of an earlier century, dressed in newer clothes, more nervous than physical. It is worth pausing on how this played out in the specific texture of a doctor's office visit because the general pattern can sound abstract until it is placed inside a single, ordinary appointment. A young woman in, say, 1920s Chicago or 1950s Manchester, presenting with sudden blurred vision that had partially resolved by the time she finally saw a physician, might be examined carefully, found to have no obvious external injury, and sent home with a recommendation to rest, to avoid overexertion. Perhaps to consider whether some recent stress or emotional strain might be contributing. She would very likely be believed to be experiencing something real. She would, just as likely, not be believed to be experiencing something physical, a distinction that, from the outside, can look almost identical, a doctor speaking kindly, taking notes, prescribing rest, and yet one that, from the inside, determines everything about whether the actual underlying disease process is ever investigated at all. This was not simply lingering prejudice with nothing behind it. MS in its early stages is, by its nature, an unusually difficult disease to diagnose. Its symptoms are frequently invisible to an outside observer. They can appear, worsen, and then partially or fully resolve, sometimes over the course of days, which can make a patient's own account of her symptoms sound, to an unfamiliar listener, inconsistent or exaggerated, even when it is neither. For much of the 20th century, before modern brain imaging existed, there was often no way to physically confirm what a patient was reporting beyond that report itself, which left an enormous amount of room for a doctor's existing assumptions about a particular patient, shaped heavily by her sex, to fill the gap where hard evidence should have been. It is worth pausing, too, on exactly how a diagnosis of MS was typically reached across much of the 20th century, because the process itself, painstaking and often prolonged, created ample room for exactly this kind of dismissal to take root before a physical explanation was ever confirmed. Before reliable brain imaging became available, diagnosing multiple sclerosis often required watching a patient's symptoms unfold over months or even years, waiting to see whether a second, distinct neurological episode would eventually occur in a different part of the body, since a single isolated episode could not, on its own, confirm the diagnosis. This meant that for a meaningful stretch of time, sometimes a very long stretch, a patient disproportionately likely to be a woman might present with a first genuine neurological symptom, be examined, find nothing conclusive, and be sent home to simply wait and see what happened next. It was precisely within that long, uncertain waiting period before a second episode arrived to confirm the pattern that older, faster, less patient explanations, nerves, stress, anxiety tended to rush in to fill the gap. There is a specific, measurable statistic worth sitting with here because it tells its own quiet story about how this disease's relationship with gender has actually shifted over time, and not necessarily in the direction you might expect. Multiple sclerosis has always affected women more often than men, but researchers studying long-term epidemiological data have found something more striking than a simple, stable imbalance. The ratio of women to men diagnosed with MS appears to have been rising steadily across the 20th century and into the 21st, moving from figures closer to 2 women for every 1 man in earlier data toward figures closer to 3 women for every 1 man in more recent studies. The exact cause of that shift remains an active and unresolved area of medical research, with theories ranging from changes in diet and environmental exposure to shifts in reproductive patterns, sun exposure, and vitamin D levels, though no single explanation has yet been fully confirmed. Whatever the underlying biological cause turns out to be, the practical result is a disease that, over the past century, has become steadily more concentrated in female patients, arriving at precisely the same historical moment that a great deal of Western medicine was still working, often quite slowly, to shed its older habit of treating female-predominant conditions as inherently less legitimate, less urgent, or less physically real than conditions that affected men and women in more equal numbers. And multiple sclerosis, it turns out, is far from the only condition to have lived through this particular pattern. Lupus, an autoimmune disease in which the body's own immune system attacks its healthy tissue, causing joint pain, extreme fatigue, skin rashes, and, in severe cases, damage to the kidneys, heart, and other organs, follows an even more heavily skewed ratio. Roughly 9 out of every 10 people diagnosed with lupus are women. Its symptoms, like those of early MS, are frequently vague, fluctuating, and easy to mistake for stress, overwork, or ordinary fatigue, and diagnosis is, even today, often significantly delayed as a direct result. Fibromyalgia, a condition causing widespread chronic pain, fatigue, and difficulty concentrating, shows a similarly heavy skew toward female patients, and carries with it perhaps the most direct linguistic echo of everything this story has traced so far. For much of the 20th century, before fibromyalgia was formally recognized as a distinct condition with an identifiable physical basis, patients reporting its symptoms, disproportionately women, were frequently told their pain was psychosomatic, a word that, stripped of its clinical dressing, is simply a more modern-sounding descendant of the very same idea that once sent a wandering womb pressing against the lungs of a woman in ancient Greece. The American College of Rheumatology did not publish its first formal diagnostic criteria for fibromyalgia until 1990, meaning that for the entire span of medical history before that date, going back through every century this story has walked through, patients experiencing this specific, real, and often severely disabling pattern of widespread pain had no formal diagnostic home to be placed in at all. They existed, medically speaking, in the same kind of interpretive gap Lidwina occupied in 1396, except now the surrounding vocabulary was psychiatric rather than religious, stress and nerves and psychosomatic complaints standing in for the Lord's hand and the wandering womb, performing underneath their more modern and more scientific sound, essentially the identical function, relocating the source of unexplained suffering away from the body and into some other, less physically verifiable register instead. Lupus, for its part, carries its own difficult history worth naming here. Its most visible symptom, in a significant number of patients, is a distinctive rash across the cheeks and nose, described by physicians as early as the 19th century as resembling the pattern of a wolf's bite, which is in fact where the disease gets its name, lupus being the Latin word for wolf. For decades after it was first formally described, physicians debated whether it represented a primarily skin-based condition or something with deeper, systemic internal effects, a debate not fully resolved until well into the 20th century, when improved understanding of autoimmune processes finally revealed the fuller picture, an immune system turning against the body's own healthy tissue, capable of damaging the kidneys, the heart, the joints, and the nervous system, not merely the skin. The pattern, traced across 2,000 years and half a dozen different conditions, holds a shape that is difficult to look at directly and harder still to argue with once you have seen it laid out in sequence. An illness disproportionately affects women. Its symptoms are subjective, difficult to observe from the outside, and slow or impossible to confirm with the medical technology available at the time. In the absence of a physical explanation, medicine is equipped to find the suffering is relocated instead into a psychological, moral, or reproductive register treated as a matter of temperament rather than tissue. And that relocation tends to persist, sometimes for centuries, until either the technology catches up enough to make the physical cause undeniable, or, in a great many of the specific historical cases we have walked through tonight, until men begin to report the same symptoms in numbers large enough that the condition can no longer be quietly filed away as simply a women's complaint. It would be a comforting way to end this story if we could say that all of this belongs safely to history now, a series of unfortunate but firmly closed chapters, corrected by better science and better attitudes, and left behind in the archives alongside the wandering womb and the leech jars of Augustus Desta's physicians. It would be comforting. It would also not be entirely true, and this story has come too far, walked through too many centuries of careful honesty to soften its landing with something that is not. In 2001, two researchers named Diane Hoffman and Anita Tarzian published a paper that would go on to become one of the most widely cited pieces of medical literature on this subject, titled, "With a Bluntness That Still Lands, The Girl Who Cried Pain." Reviewing the existing medical literature available to them at the time, they found a pattern that should, by this point in our story, feel entirely familiar. Women, across a wide range of studies, consistently reported more frequent pain, more severe pain, and pain of longer duration than men, and despite reporting more pain by every measure available, women were again and again treated for that pain less aggressively than men were. The specific studies behind that finding are worth sitting with individually because the pattern they describe is not vague or abstract. Researchers examining emergency room treatment for patients presenting with acute abdominal pain found that men waited, on average, notably less time before receiving pain medication than women did, despite reporting comparable levels of distress. Other researchers, studying patients recovering from certain surgical procedures, found something even more specific and even harder to look past. Comparing men and women recovering from equivalent operations, they found that men were more likely to be prescribed active pain relief, while women reporting the same post-surgical pain were more likely to be given a sedative instead, a medication that calms distress and induces rest, rather than one that actually addresses the underlying source of pain. Read that again slowly. Not less pain medication. A different category of medication entirely, one built to quiet a patient rather than treat her. That distinction, sedation instead of treatment, calm instead of cure, sits so close to the oldest thread in this entire story that it is almost impossible not to notice the echo. A woman reports pain. Rather than investigating its physical cause, the system responds by managing her emotional presentation of that pain instead. It is, in a quieter, more clinical form, wearing a white coat instead of a priest's collar, essentially the same reflex that once told Lidwina's family the Lord's hand had touched her and left it there. The vocabulary has modernized considerably. The underlying instinct, treat the woman's distress rather than the disease producing it, has proven remarkably resistant to time. There is a specific number worth naming here too, since it captures something the general pattern alone cannot. Researchers studying paramedic responses in the pre-hospital setting, the earliest possible point of medical contact for many patients, have found that the sex of a patient measurably affects how aggressively pain is managed even before a hospital is ever reached, with women in acute pain less likely than men to receive opioid analgesia from paramedics responding to the same category of call. This detail matters because it pushes the pattern earlier and earlier in the chain of care, back past the emergency room, past the surgeon, all the way to the very first medical professional a patient in crisis is likely to encounter, suggesting this is not a bias confined to any single specialty or setting, but something woven more broadly through the instincts of an entire profession. This same underlying pattern has a name in cardiology too, one worth mentioning here because it demonstrates how far beyond pain management alone this bias has been documented to reach. Researchers studying heart disease, historically understood and studied primarily through data gathered from male patients, have described what they call the Yentl syndrome, in which women experiencing genuine cardiac events are more likely than men to have their symptoms initially misattributed to anxiety or stress, delaying the recognition and treatment of a condition that, unlike many of the others in this story, can prove fatal within hours rather than years. The name itself, borrowed from a story about a young woman who could only gain access to the education she needed by disguising herself as a man, captures the underlying argument with an uncomfortable precision. A woman's report of severe chest pain has, in a meaningful number of documented cases, needed to somehow present itself more convincingly, more urgently, or more like a man's report of the same symptom, before it was taken with the seriousness it required. Nowhere is this pattern more measurable in the present day than in the story of endometriosis, a condition in which tissue similar to the lining of the uterus grows outside it, causing severe pelvic pain, particularly during menstruation, along with a range of other symptoms and, for many patients, significant difficulty conceiving. Endometriosis affects an estimated 1 in every 10 women of reproductive age worldwide, which places it, by prevalence alone, in the same conversation as far more widely known conditions like diabetes. It was first formally described in the medical literature in 1860, a full 8 years before Charcot would name multiple sclerosis in the very same city. And yet, across dozens of studies conducted in different countries using different methodologies, the average time between a patient first reporting symptoms of endometriosis and receiving a confirmed diagnosis has consistently landed somewhere between 7 and 10 years. Some individual studies have found average delays stretching well beyond a decade. Some individual patients, in the longest documented cases, have waited more than 20 years for a diagnosis of a condition that was first written into medical literature during the same decade. Multiple sclerosis received its name. Sit with that gap for a moment, because it is the entire argument of this story compressed into a single quiet comparison. One condition, named in Paris in 1868, took roughly a century and a quarter to produce its first real disease-modifying treatments, a long, slow, frustrating road, but a road that has, over time, been genuinely and steadily walked. Another condition, named 8 years earlier, in the very same decade, in the very same city, continues today, in hospitals with vastly more advanced diagnostic technology than anything Charcot could have imagined, to take the average patient nearly a decade to properly identify. The difference between those two timelines is not explained by the complexity of the tissue involved or the sophistication of the science required. It is explained in large part by the same pattern this entire story has traced across 600 years. Pain reported by women continues even now, even with all our modern instruments, to be believed more slowly, investigated less urgently, and explained away more readily than pain reported by men. There is a further, quieter cost to this particular gap worth naming, one that goes beyond the pain itself. Endometriosis is, in a meaningful number of cases, a progressive condition, meaning the tissue involved can continue to spread and cause worsening internal scarring the longer it goes untreated. A diagnostic delay measured in years is therefore rarely just a delay in naming the condition. It is, for many patients, a delay that allows the underlying disease process to continue advancing in the background the entire time, sometimes affecting fertility, sometimes requiring more extensive surgery later than would have been needed had the diagnosis arrived sooner. The cost of disbelief, in other words, is not merely emotional, though it is certainly that too. It is measurable, physical, and in some cases permanent, compounding quietly with every additional year a patient spends being told her pain is ordinary. Some of the most detailed recent research into this delay has moved beyond simply measuring how long it takes and started asking, more specifically, what factors make the wait even longer for some patients than others. Studies examining large patient cohorts have found that the diagnostic delay tends to stretch further for patients who are unemployed, for those managing several health conditions simultaneously, and for those with a family history of chronic pelvic pain, a pattern researchers suggest may reflect both practical barriers to accessing specialist care and a kind of compounding disbelief in which a patient already carrying one dismissed or minimized condition finds a second one dismissed more readily still. Financial comfort, by contrast, has been associated with shorter delays, along with older age at the first onset of symptoms, a detail that echoes uncomfortably with an older pattern this story has already traced, in which social position, wealth, and standing shaped not only the quality of care a person received historically, but continues, even now, to shape how quickly a patient's pain is believed and acted upon. It is worth being fair, too, to what has genuinely improved, because this story has been careful throughout not to overstate the darkness of any single era, and the present moment deserves that same care. Medical bodies in multiple countries have, in recent years, issued updated clinical guidance specifically aimed at shortening the endometriosis diagnostic gap, encouraging physicians to consider the diagnosis earlier in younger patients, and without requiring the invasive surgical confirmation that was, for decades, treated as the only acceptable form of proof. Awareness campaigns, patient advocacy organizations, and a growing body of published research have all pushed steadily and cumulatively in the direction of shorter delays and earlier recognition. The gap has not closed. In some recent studies, it has troublingly even widened slightly rather than narrowed, a reminder that this kind of progress is neither automatic nor guaranteed simply by the passage of time. But the direction of the effort, unlike so much of the 400 silent years this story walked through earlier, is now unmistakably toward investigation rather than away from it. Researchers studying why this gap persists, even in the present day, point to a familiar constellation of causes. Menstrual pain, specifically, has a long cultural history of being treated as simply normal, an expected and unremarkable part of being a woman, rather than a potential symptom of underlying disease, which means both patients and the doctors they consult can be slower to recognize severe pain as something requiring investigation rather than endurance. Many patients report being told, across multiple appointments and sometimes multiple years, that their pain is simply a normal part of their cycle, that they should try to manage it, that it is, in one form or another, simply what their body does. It is worth noticing one final time how closely that framing sits alongside the very oldest thread in this entire story. Something about being a woman is in itself sufficient explanation for the suffering, no further investigation required. There is also a structural piece to this delay that deserves mention, separate from any individual physician's judgment. In many healthcare systems, confirming an endometriosis diagnosis with full certainty has historically required a specific surgical procedure, a laparoscopy, performed under general anesthesia, allowing a surgeon to directly view and, if needed, sample the tissue in question. That requirement, reasonable as it was intended to be, meant that for decades, a definitive diagnosis was gated behind an invasive, resource-intensive procedure rather than a blood test or a scan, which in turn meant that a great many physicians, quite reasonably by the standards of their own training, hesitated to refer a patient for surgery until her symptoms had been severe and persistent for a very long time. It is only in the past several years that clinical guidance in multiple countries has begun shifting away from this surgery-first requirement, allowing physicians to diagnose and begin treating endometriosis based on symptoms and imaging alone, a change that, if it holds and spreads widely enough, may finally begin to close a gap that has remained stubbornly wide for over a century and a half. There is one more piece of this pattern worth walking through before this story lets itself rest, because it explains, in the most practical terms available, why so many of the gaps described tonight have proven so slow to close, even now, even with modern imaging, modern laboratories, and modern clinical trials available in ways no century before ours could have imagined. Autoimmune diseases, the broad category of conditions in which the body's own immune system turns against its healthy tissue, include multiple sclerosis, lupus, and more than 80 other recognized conditions. Across that entire category, roughly 80% of diagnosed patients are women. It is one of the most consistent, most heavily documented patterns in all of modern medicine, and it has been known, in general terms, for decades. And yet, researchers studying where medical research funding actually goes have found again and again that conditions affecting mostly or exclusively women receive funding disproportionately smaller than the burden those conditions place on the population would seem to justify. One widely cited analysis examining the relationship between disease burden and research funding across a broad range of conditions found that diseases predominantly affecting women, migraine, chronic fatigue syndrome, endometriosis, and several autoimmune conditions among them, were consistently underfunded relative to the suffering and disability they caused, while diseases predominantly affecting men tended, on average, to receive funding closer to or even exceeding what their burden alone would predict. The imbalance was not uniform across every condition, and it was not always dramatic, but it appeared often enough across enough different diseases, studied by enough different independent researchers, that it stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like pattern. Cardiovascular research offers one particularly stark illustration. Heart disease remains a leading cause of death for women as well as men, and women continue, even today, to experience worse outcomes after a heart attack than men do, including higher rates of death. And yet only a small fraction of cardiovascular research funding, by some recent estimates as little as 4%, goes specifically toward research focused on women's cardiovascular health, despite the well-documented reality that heart disease can present differently and be more easily missed in female patients than in male ones. This is the modern, well-funded, technologically sophisticated descendant of exactly the same problem this story opened with: a body reporting real, dangerous physical symptoms, and a medical system built disproportionately around a template that was not designed with that body specifically in mind. It goes further than funding alone. For much of the 20th century, the default subject of biomedical research, the body a new drug or treatment was tested on before ever being approved for general use, was overwhelmingly male in both animal studies and human clinical trials. Women of childbearing age were for decades formally excluded from many early-phase drug trials in the United States, following a policy adopted after concerns about fetal harm from a specific drug tragedy in the 1960s, a policy that, while adopted with genuinely protective intentions, had the lasting side effect of building decades of pharmaceutical knowledge almost entirely around male physiology. The consequences of that gap are still being tallied. Women, on average, experience adverse drug reactions at meaningfully higher rates than men do, a disparity researchers now understand is at least partly explained by dosing guidelines calculated for decades, primarily from data gathered on male bodies, then applied afterward, with only minor adjustment to everyone else. None of this is offered here as a simple story of villains and victims, because the truth underneath it is messier and, in its own way, more useful to understand than that would be. Much of this gap grew out of decisions that were, at the time, defensible or even genuinely protective, layered one on top of another across decades, each one reasonable enough on its own terms, until the accumulated weight of them produced a medical research infrastructure quietly built, by default rather than by malice, around one particular kind of body. Recognizing that is not an accusation. It is closer to a diagnosis in its own right, an explanation, finally, for why so much of this story's more recent chapters, the pain gap research, the endometriosis delay, the persistent underfunding of conditions like MS and lupus relative to their burden, keep circling back to the same underlying shape. Even now, even in an era that likes to think of itself as having left the wandering womb safely behind in the history books. There is real, active work underway to change this, and it deserves to be named here gently before this story lets itself rest for the night. New offices, new funding initiatives, new strategic research plans focused specifically on autoimmune disease and women's health have been established in recent years, built by researchers and advocates who have spent careers making exactly the argument this chapter has just walked through patiently with data to institutions that were, for a very long time, simply not looking. Progress of this kind rarely arrives as a single dramatic announcement. It arrives the way most of the progress in this story has arrived, slowly, unevenly, one funding decision and one clinical guideline and one persistent advocate at a time, each one small on its own, each one part of the same very long thread this whole story has been following since a girl fell on the ice in 1396. It is worth naming, too, the shape of the argument that has finally begun moving some of this funding, because it is a genuinely different kind of argument than the ones this story spent its earlier centuries watching fail. It is not primarily an appeal to sympathy, though sympathy has certainly played its part. It is an appeal to evidence, carefully gathered, carefully published, difficult to dismiss precisely because it is built from the very tools modern medicine claims to respect most: large data sets, peer-reviewed analysis, funding-to-burden ratios laid out in stark, undeniable numbers. Where a 14th century physician could close the case on Lidwina with a single unexamined sentence about the Lord's hand, a modern research funding body, faced with a published, rigorously documented funding-to-burden ratio for chronic fatigue syndrome or migraine, has a considerably harder time simply looking away. The tools of persuasion have changed as much as the tools of diagnosis have, and both changes point, however slowly, in the same direction. There is a specific comparison worth sitting with, drawn from that same research into funding and burden, because it captures the pattern in a single striking figure. Researchers examining the ratio between disease burden and research funding across dozens of conditions found that for HIV and AIDS, a condition disproportionately affecting men, the funding-to-burden ratio came out considerably above 1, meaning the condition received more research investment than its measured burden alone would predict. For chronic fatigue syndrome, a condition disproportionately affecting women, the same ratio came out at a small fraction of 1, meaning the condition received only a tiny sliver of the funding its measured burden would predict. Placed side by side, those two numbers say, more efficiently than any paragraph of description could, exactly what 600 years of this story have been building toward. The question was never really whether medicine had the tools to take a condition seriously. It was, and in places still is, whether medicine chose to point those tools in that particular direction at all. A diagnosis today. It is worth ending this particular thread of the story in the present, in an ordinary neurology clinic, because the contrast with everything that came before is, in its own quiet way, the most hopeful part of tonight's story. A patient walks in today reporting the kind of symptoms that once took Lidwina 38 years to fully live through and never receive a name for. Blurred vision in one eye, a strange tingling down one arm, a weakness in one leg that comes and goes. In 1396, this constellation of symptoms would have been handed eventually to God or to a wandering womb, or to nothing at all beyond a family quietly adjusting its expectations of what its daughter could still be asked to do. In the early 2000s, even with Charcot's name for the disease already more than a century old, a patient walking in with these same symptoms could still expect to wait an average of around 4 years before a confirmed diagnosis, watching and waiting through repeat episodes. The same patient watch-and-see approach doctors have long called sitting back to see if the disease would declare itself. Today, that same patient can, in a great many cases, walk out of her very first specialist appointment with an MRI already scheduled for later that same week. A set of internationally recognized guidelines called the McDonald criteria, first published in 2001 and revised several times since, most recently in 2024, now allow a neurologist to look for 2 specific things inside the imaging and clinical history. Dissemination in space, meaning damage appearing in more than one distinct area of the brain or spinal cord, and dissemination in time, meaning evidence that this damage happened at more than one distinct point, not all at once. Advances in MRI technology, along with newer laboratory tests examining the fluids surrounding the brain and spinal cord for specific markers, now allow both of those things to sometimes be confirmed from a single set of scans and tests, gathered within days of a patient's very first symptom, rather than requiring years of watching and waiting for a second episode to arrive on its own. The average time from first symptom to confirmed diagnosis has fallen, as a direct result, from roughly 4 years in the early 2000s to closer to 12 months today, and for a meaningful number of patients, a diagnosis can now be reached within weeks, sometimes even days, of that very first symptom. It is difficult to overstate how significant that shift actually is, set against the 6 centuries this story has just walked through, a disease that once had no name at all for 500 years, and no reliable diagnosis for another 130 after that, can now, for many patients, be identified before a single relapse has even fully resolved. That progress matters enormously because time itself is part of the treatment. Modern disease-modifying therapies for MS work best. Current research consistently shows the earlier they are started, meaning that closing the diagnostic gap is not simply a matter of giving patients a name for their suffering sooner, satisfying as that alone would be. It is a matter of giving them a measurably better chance at a normal life with less accumulated disability because the underlying disease process was recognized and addressed before it had years, rather than months, to continue quietly doing damage. None of which means the story has fully closed its gap, even here, even now. Misdiagnosis remains a real and documented problem, with some research suggesting that as many as 1 in 5 people carrying an MS diagnosis may, on closer examination, have been diagnosed incorrectly, their actual condition being something else entirely that happens to mimic MS closely enough to be mistaken for it. And the newer, faster diagnostic tools available today are not evenly distributed around the world, or even evenly distributed within wealthy countries. Access to a 3 Tesla MRI machine, to a neurologist experienced specifically in demyelinating disease, to the specific laboratory tests the newest McDonald criteria call for, still depends heavily on where a patient happens to live, what insurance or public health coverage she happens to have, and how quickly her early, often vague symptoms are taken seriously enough by a first physician to warrant a referral to someone who can run those tests at all. The gap between what modern medicine is capable of and what any individual patient actually receives has narrowed. It has not disappeared. It is worth remembering, here at the very end of this particular thread, that the criteria making all of this possible carry a person's name for a reason worth honoring. Ian MacDonald, the neurologist who led the international panel that first published these guidelines in 2001, spent much of his own long career specifically focused on improving MS diagnosis, refining and pushing forward exactly the kind of systematic, evidence-based approach that Charcot had first attempted in 1868, but with a full century and more of additional imaging technology, immunology, and clinical research behind him. The criteria have been revised repeatedly since his original work, most recently in 2024, each revision incorporating newer evidence, newer imaging capability, newer understanding of exactly which patterns of damage most reliably indicate the disease. It is, in its own quiet way, a form of tribute worth noticing, an entire international field of neurology continuing, generation after generation, to sharpen and refine the single, simple, radical idea Charcot first proposed in that lecture hall in Paris, that this suffering has a physical cause, and that cause can be found if enough careful people keep looking closely enough for long enough. Picture, one final time, the distance traveled between the two ends of this particular thread. On one end, a 14th century physician standing at a bedside examining a young woman's paralyzed legs by candlelight, armed with nothing but observation, inherited theory, and his own honest bewilderment, ultimately reaching for the only explanation his century equipped him with. On the other end, a modern neurologist sitting in front of a computer screen, reviewing a high-resolution MRI scan taken only days earlier, cross-referencing it against internationally agreed criteria refined through more than 2 decades of accumulated global research, able to say, with real confidence, grounded in real evidence, here is what is happening inside this particular body, and here is what we are going to do about it. 600 years and countless uncounted lives separate those two bedsides. It is worth letting yourself feel, honestly, both halves of what that distance means. How far there still is to go for the diseases and the patients this story has shown you still waiting on the far side of that same gap, and how far, against every reasonable expectation of a species that took 500 years just to give one disease its first proper name, we have somehow, slowly, unevenly, actually managed to come. Still, sit for a moment with the shape of that improvement because it is real, and because this story has earned the right, after everything it has walked through, to let itself feel a measure of quiet hope about it. 600 years ago, a girl's collapsing legs were explained by the touch of God, and nothing more was ever asked. Today, a woman with the same collapsing legs can, in a great many parts of the world, walk into a clinic and walk out within a week with an actual name for what is happening inside her body, a treatment plan built around slowing it, and a neurologist who arrived at that plan not through prayer or guesswork, but through a carefully built, internationally agreed, continuously revised body of evidence that traces its own lineage directly back to a lecture hall in Paris in 1868, and further back still to 2 men independently peering through early microscopes in the 1830s, and further back even than that, to a 14-year-old girl whose fall on the ice nobody in her own lifetime ever had the tools to properly explain. Let the room grow quiet again. Let the hospitals and the courtrooms and the emergency wards recede a little, back into the distance where history keeps them, and return for a moment to the ice. Think, too, of how much of this story you have just carried without ever needing to remember a single date. A girl on a frozen canal. A physician offering the only explanation his century could hold. A woman in Iceland, healed within 7 days, for reasons her own world called miraculous. A prince's grandson filling notebook after notebook with the patient, private discipline of a man determined to be believed by someone, even if only by his own future self reading the pages back, a hospital in Paris holding thousands of women within the same walls, becoming, almost by accident, the birthplace of an entire modern medical discipline. A word, hysteria, travelling quietly for 2,000 years before finally, gently, being allowed to retire. And a gap, still open today, between the moment a woman first describes her pain and the moment someone finally writes down its proper name. There is a particular kind of comfort worth naming before this story lets itself rest completely in simply having walked the whole length of something this long. 600 years compressed into a single evening's listening is, in its own way, a strange and generous gift, one that no single person living through any one century of this story ever actually had access to. Lidwina never knew about Haldora, born 2 centuries before her in a country she likely never heard of. Augustus d'Este never knew his careful diaries would one day sit alongside a medieval saint's biography in the same historical record. Charcot, walking between his 2 very different lecture halls, could not have known that a funding analysis, or a diagnostic criteria revision, or a paper called The Girl Who Cried Pain would one day complete threads he had only just begun to pull. You, tonight, have had the rare privilege of holding the whole shape of it at once, watching 6 centuries lean quietly toward one another, each one setting down a small part of the answer for the next one to eventually pick up. Picture Schiedam once more. The frozen canal. The low grey Dutch sky. A girl who was, before any of this, simply the best skater on the ice that particular morning. It is worth remembering that Lidwina was never only a case study, or a saint, or a data point in the long argument this story has been quietly making. She was, before the fall, and for a while after it too, a person with a talent she loved, and friends who called her name across the ice, and a life that had every reason to unfold as ordinarily and as briefly rememberedly as any other life in a small medieval town. What happened to her afterward, the 4 decades in bed, the pain with no name, the slow closing of the world down to the size of a single room, was not something she chose, and not something anyone around her fully understood, and not, in the end, something that mattered any less for having gone unexplained. Her suffering was real, whether or not 14th century Holland had a word for it. That is, perhaps the gentlest and truest way to say what this whole story has been circling for the last several hours. The absence of an explanation never once meant the absence of the thing itself. The same is true of Halldóra in Iceland 200 years earlier, whose sight and whose steadiness returned to her after 7 days of prayer, for reasons her century called miraculous, and ours would more likely call remission, though both words, in their own way, are simply names we give to something the body does that we do not fully understand. The same is true of Augustus d'Este, filling notebook after notebook with careful, private observations of his own failing legs, trying, in the only way available to him, to hold on to some sense of authorship over what was happening inside his own body. The same is true of Blanche and Augustine and Geneviève, photographed mid-seizure in a lecture hall in Paris, whose actual names we happen to know only because their suffering was, for a period, considered entertaining enough to record. And the same is true tonight of anyone listening to this story who has ever sat across from a doctor and felt their own account of their own body quietly not be believed. That experience, whatever shape it took, whatever century or hospital or waiting room it happened in, belongs to the same long thread this story has followed from a frozen canal in 1396 all the way to the present moment. It is an old thread. It is a slowly, unevenly loosening one. It has never, in 600 years, moved in a straight line toward justice, but it has moved, and it continues to move, a little further with every physician who chooses to investigate rather than explain away, every researcher who studies why a diagnostic gap persists instead of simply accepting that it does, every named disease that used to have no name at all. There is something worth holding on to in that slowness, strange as it might sound to say so. Progress in this particular story was never a single dramatic moment. It was not one lecture in 1868 that fixed everything, the way it can be tempting to tell it. It was Cuvelier and Carswell working quietly and separately with early microscopes in the 1830s. It was Charcot, imperfect and contradictory, walking the same hospital corridor between 2 entirely different legacies. It was researchers a century later, sitting with old Salpêtrière patient files, willing to ask an uncomfortable question about how many of those women had been looking at the wrong diagnosis the entire time. It was 2 researchers in 2001 gathering decades of scattered studies into one paper with a title blunt enough that nobody reading it could look away from what it was actually saying. Small, cumulative, unglamorous acts of simply continuing to look, generation after generation, at something earlier generations had decided was not worth looking at closely. It is worth remembering, too, that none of the people at the center of tonight's story set out to become part of a 600-year argument about how carefully medicine listens to women. Lidwina wanted, before the ice took her legs from her, simply to be the fastest skater on a frozen canal. Augustus d'Este wanted, more than anything else his diaries reveal, simply to understand his own failing body well enough to have some say in it. Blanche, Augustine, and Geneviève, whatever their names actually meant to them beyond the photographs that preserved them, likely wanted nothing more than an ordinary life, unphotographed, unobserved, uncatalogued. History assigned each of them a role in a much larger story only in retrospect, long after they themselves had simply been trying, as anyone in pain tries, to be believed and to be helped. There is a gentle symmetry worth noticing too in how this story keeps returning to the same small handful of actions across 600 years and dozens of very different settings. Someone falls or begins to weaken or begins to hurt in a way they cannot explain. Someone else, a doctor, a priest, a family member, a researcher, decides whether to keep looking or to close the question with whatever explanation is easiest to reach. And somewhere, quietly, a record survives or does not survive, a diary is kept or is never begun, a name is written down or is simply allowed to disappear into the ordinary, unremembered texture of an ordinary life. Multiply that single small moment by 6 centuries, by thousands upon thousands of individual bodies, and you have, in essence, the entire history this story has just walked you through. Somewhere in a hospital tonight, in whichever city you happen to be listening from, a physician is looking at a chart, weighing a patient's own description of her pain against everything modern medicine can and cannot yet measure, and deciding, in that quiet, unremarkable moment, whether to believe her or to look for a gentler word to file her under instead. That decision is being made right now, in ordinary rooms, by ordinary people, the way it has been made in ordinary rooms for the last 600 years. It will keep being made tomorrow and the day after that. The story is not finished. It was never going to be finished by the end of a single quiet evening's telling. But it is for tonight a good place to rest. The ice has long since melted. The Salpêtrière still stands in Paris, a teaching hospital now, its Tuesday lectures decades gone, its gong put away for good. Lidwina's grave has drawn pilgrims for nearly 600 years and will, in all likelihood, draw a few more tomorrow. And somewhere, right now, a girl or a woman is describing a symptom to a doctor who is, this time, choosing to listen all the way to the end of the sentence before deciding what it means. Let that be the last picture you carry with you into sleep tonight. Not the wandering womb, not the gong, not the years of waiting. Just a doctor, quiet, attentive, choosing, this time, to listen. The candle by the bed has burned low now, if there ever was a candle at all, and the room around you has gone soft at the edges, the way rooms do at this hour. The ice is quiet. The hospital corridors are empty. The centuries have settled back down into paper and archive and dust, exactly where they belong while you rest. Somewhere, a canal you will never see is still frozen. A diary you will never read is still sitting closed on a shelf in an English archive. A hospital that once staged Tuesday demonstrations for a curious public now teaches ordinary neurology to ordinary students. Its gong long since retired, its corridors quiet in a completely different way than they once were loud. None of it needs you to carry it any further tonight. It will still be there tomorrow and the night after that, waiting patiently, the way history always does, for whenever you feel like visiting it again. There is nothing more to explain tonight, nothing more to diagnose, nothing more to prove, nothing left to carry into the dark with you except the simple, steady fact that you are warm and safe and allowed finally to stop thinking about any of it at all. Let your shoulders soften into the mattress. Let your breathing slow to match the quiet in the room. Let the story close itself gently, the way a book closes on its own when a hand finally lets it go. And if you would rather carry this whole library with you tomorrow into the car or the train or a walk somewhere quiet, it is all there waiting on Spotify, link in the description and the pinned comment whenever you would like it. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Before you go, if you are still awake enough to answer, I would love to know, which historical figure from tonight's story stayed with you the most? Lidwina on the ice, Augustus and his diaries, or the women of the Salpêtrière? Let me know in the comments. And now, sleep well.